Enoch Brader himself actually created the symposium for Arthur Miller, entitled Arthur Miller's America, Theater and Culture in a Century of Change. And then, using modern technology, Mr. Brader held a live conversation with Mr. Miller by satellite from his Connecticut home.
If I'd known there was going to be this much praise, I would have been more careful about falling down.
Well, we want you to get better as soon as possible, because when that happens, we'll have your back here. So don't fall again, okay?
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to have a conversation now. I'm telling the audience and you this at the same time, what we discussed on the telephone. This is not an interview. We're just going to have what I hope is a fruitful conversation about your work and some of your ideas about the theater. Let's begin with the University of Michigan, since that's where we are today. About a dozen of my students, and I'm sure several people in this audience, wondered, really, why did you come to the University of Michigan? Why didn't someone like you go to City College, which would have been a very logical path in the middle of the Depression?
Well, I did go to City College for about 3 weeks in the evening rather, because I was working during the daytime, but I couldn't stay awake. And so I decided I'd work for a few years and make enough money to go to school in the daytime. I was a little better at staying awake in the daytime. Anyway, coming to Michigan was, as you stated earlier, mainly because at that time it was probably the only university in the United States that had an active interest in creative writing. At least I knew of no other. And there was that, and there was also that the tuition was so cheap, and money was difficult to come by. So those are the reasons.
Did your family think it was odd that you were coming all the way to the Midwest, leaving New York and all that world behind you?
Well, I looked at it as a kind of adventure. I thought of it as the Wild West. I was amazed that in Detroit they had the same cars we had in New York. But it was for a young guy, it was a great adventure. People didn't jump into airplanes in those days and fly off to some place. Moving around was a good deal more difficult.
How often did you when you were a student here, how often did you get back to New York during those days?
Well, I got back during the Christmas vacation, and that was about it. I usually had to work during the spring vacation, and in fact, that's when I wrote my first play, was during the spring vacation. So I got back once each year.
Tell us about the Daily. I mean, one of the things we discovered when we looked through those dusty volumes of forgotten lore, why did you stop writing for the Daily?
Well, because I started to win prizes for my plays, and I wanted to spend more time writing plays. And I lost my impulse to do journalism because I tended to want to make the stories better. And that left fact behind a good deal of the time. So I found I wasn't as really made to be a reporter. And the only thing about journalism was they had a payroll, and that wasn't the case in theater. You were completely on your own there and could easily starve to death. But I decided to pursue the theater because I loved it.
What drew you to Professor Rowe's class? I mean, the Kenneth Rowe, who was an important person in your life here at Michigan. How did you get connected with him?
Well, I had a wonderful teacher named Eric Walder, who later became the dean of the university. And Professor Walder directed me toward Kenneth Rowe. And in fact, it was actually in Kenneth Walder's essay class that I wrote my first play. It was only later that I went to Professor Rowe, and it was a great event in my life because Rowe, while he, I'm sure, wanted to teach me a lot, taught me only really one thing, and that was that I could hold the stage with dialogue. And he acquainted me with the history of the theater and with the development of various forms, and it was a quick way of getting educated.
Let's talk a little bit about the plays that you started writing once you left Michigan. What were you writing just before The Man Who Had All the Luck was done on Broadway in '44?
Well, I wrote the Hopwood plays. There were, I think, 3 plays there. And then when I got out of school, I wrote a tragedy of the conquest of Mexico by Cortez and the fascinating story of Montezuma. Of course, being ignorant of what was going on Broadway and the commercial theater, mind you, there was no non-commercial theater at that time. You either made it on Broadway or you didn't make it at all. And I wrote this tragedy, which had, I don't know, probably 25 characters in it, which was an absurdity as far as getting it produced on the commercial theater. The commercial theater regarded an 8-character play as being excessive. So I couldn't get that produced, but I had hoped that on the Federal Theater, which was, of course, a theater-based, subsidized by the government, and I'd hoped that they would be able to do it, but the Federal Theater folded within, I don't know, 6 or 8 months after I got onto it. And so I never did get that play produced at all, excepting many years later in England, where they did it on television, and they did many readings of it.
You know, you had a lot of jobs at that period. Do you remember much of your work days at the Brooklyn Navy Yard?
Well, that was during World War II. I was rejected for the Army because of a wounded leg that I had as a result of playing football stupidly in high school. And that work was, I wanted to do something that was related to the war effort, so I took a job there. But at the same time, I was writing programs for radio. The DuPont radio program called Cavalcade of America, also several others. And I do that in the daytime and work 11 hours at night in the yard. I was a ship fitter's helper and finally became a ship fitter. It was a terrific experience. It was wonderful work, although I never did understand how we managed to get ships out of the yard and onto the high seas without sinking, because few of us knew very much about anything. The yard before the war had 6,000 workers in it who were highly trained people. During the war, it had 60,000. And we were all loafers from every kind of a position in the society. And nobody knew a ship from a hole in a wall. And how we managed to repair and build ships is still an amazement to me. But they floated.
Well, we did win the war.